in the dimly lit corridor beneath the crumbling ruins of the old world, where moss-covered stone whispered of centuries gone and the faint hum of forgotten systems pulsed like a heartbeat, a dungeon awakening stirred into motion. They said the system governed all things. Yet that day, when a forgotten janitor's past unfolded, even the ancient laws etched in monotouched stone began to fracture under the pressure of something older, something raw, as dust rained down from the collapsed ceilings, and spectral echoes of former adventurers moaned between walls. A system anomaly began to overwrite the rules. One silent pulse at a time. He wasn't chosen, nor summoned, but still he came dragging behind him the weight of broom and blood. As the air itself twisted around him, an hidden core activation ignited. Monsters that once roared with bloodlust fell into hushed silence, not out of fear, but because power without stats had awakened something they instinctively knew not to challenge. In a chamber soaked with the scent of sulfur and regret, the man who was never part of the game became its glitch, its rewrite, its silent revolt. The system didn't announce his arrival with flashing lights or golden fanfare. It murmured his existence like a virus, rewriting divine code, subtly but completely. Once, he had watched as heroes claimed titles, looted chests, and laughed their way out of battles. He barely survived cleaning up after. But today, standing before the shattered gate of floor 93, he wasn't a bystander. He was the last variable unaccounted for. His hands were calloused, not from swordplay but from scrubbing arcane residue and bloodstains that not even potions could wash away. In those stains, he'd learned how blades swung, how monsters moved, how spells distorted space and time when cast in desperation. He didn't gain experience points, but he gained something far more dangerous. Understanding without limits, memory without mercy. When the alarms failed, and the hunters fled, and the system hesitated, he alone moved forward. The broom he held was no weapon, but it carried the echoes of 10,000 battles, each fiber stained with history, pain, and forgotten names. The dungeon recognized him not through code, but through blood, through echo, through the silence between heartbeat and algorithm. System notification. Unregistered entity detected. Qualities matched. Endurance, memory, absorption. Assigning role. Dungeon Warden, activating subsystem, symbiotic memory layer. And with that, the walls trembled not from collapse, but from acknowledgement. The stone under his feet shimmered faintly, pulsing like breath returning to a dead god's lungs. All around him, monsters stopped moving, eyes glowing with an intelligence they hadn't possessed moments before. Some knelt, others whimpered. One a minotaur champion shattered its own horn and offered it to him without a word. He didn't know what to say. He only nodded and the system shifted again. He didn't speak. Each step he took was etched into the dungeon's memory, not as code, but as prophecy. Where traps once lay dormant, they now sprang open to guide him like nervous children welcoming a long-lost father. He'd passed murals he'd never noticed before, murals that now showed him standing at the heart of a labyrinth with keys in both hands. Atop the central platform, where the dungeon core flickered with dying light, a new protocol emerged from corrupted lines of light. Core error. Identity conflict. Override initiated by entity unknown. New title generated discovering of residual systems. But whispering, he remembered every room he'd cleaned, every corpse he'd stepped over, every tear he'd swallowed. It didn't make sense, he didn't understand it, but the dungeon did, and that was enough. Tendrils of mana reached toward him, not like lightning, but like vines, desperate to cling to something real. As the mana surged through his veins, Not burning memories weren't a burden, they were fuel. He became the sum of every mistake made in the dungeon, and every mistake corrected by his hands. No hunter had ever walked these paths alone and lived, but he had, for years. And now those paths were formed beneath his feet, aligning, glowing, breathing. Outside, in the world above, the guilds argued, the kings debated, the gods looked away. But below, in the depths of floor 93, a new rule had been written. Respect the warden, or be erased. Even the monsters began to whisper his name, though it had never been spoken aloud. They called him the Echo, because he was the sound that came after the end, the reminder that something had survived. The first challenger came not with fangs or claws, but with a question. "Do you accept the throne?" And he said nothing, but stepped forward, which was enough. The challenger vanished, dissolved, integrated into the warden's stats. He didn't grow stronger in numbers, but stronger in meaning. The system hesitated once more, then adapted. Hidden skill unlocked. Inheritance of forgotten protocols. Passive. Cleanse error. Purify corruption. / absorb remnant code. Effect. The more forgotten you are, the more absolute your command becomes. He was no longer part of the system. He was what happened when the system broke. The hunters who once mocked him began to hear whispers, whispers of a man who stood where the blood couldn't be mopped anymore, whispers of a dungeon that obeyed only one name now, and that name wasn't theirs. They tried to return with holorellos and high-level spells. They brought artifacts blessed by sky priests and scrolls written by time weavers, but the dungeon no longer welcomed them. Doors refused to open. Floors looped endlessly. Traps reset without logic. And always, he was watching. Not with eyes, with memory, because the dungeon remembered them, too, and it hated what it remembered. He didn't laugh when they begged. He didn't scream when they cursed. He simply raised his broom, and the entire floor obeyed. No more heroes, no more raids, no more system missions. Just the warden and the balance he maintained. For every drop of blood he once cleaned, a new law was written. For every overlooked breath, a new corridor formed. The dungeon was no longer a place. It was a will. And so, the system added one final line to its changelog. Do not interfere with the janitor. And the world above never saw him again. But those who ventured too deep, they never stopped seeing him. The surface world believed the dungeon had stabilized, that the disturbance in the lower floors had been patched by the emergency patches, pushed by the Grand System Council, and yet none of them knew that deep below the 93rd floor the heartbeat. They thought they silenced had only paused to listen, to learn, to evolve into something the code itself could no longer cage. Once the so-called heroes would descend with sacred compasses, relics that pointed to quest objectives and danger zones. But now the relics spun wildly, their needles dancing like drunk dancers around an invisible axis that bent reality from a point no algorithm could explain. Sealed away in mythical chains, forged by forgotten gods, stirred restlessly as if sensing their own gods had been replaced by something neither divine nor mortal. He no longer walked like a man. He drifted, almost unmoored from time, his every step triggering silent tremors that realigned entire corridors and even the oldest monsters. It bent to reveal a hidden room, as though the dungeon itself offered its secrets to the one soul who had never sought them. His presence echoed not with footsteps, but with the groan of moving stone and the scent of ozone. And when he looked upon a wall, there were no quests issued for him, but events unfolded in his wake. Subterranean cathedrals of bone, collapsed labyrinths, unraveled into spirals of madness, because his pain was never digital. It was lived, cleaned, catalogued, and endured. And he granted it not as a master, but as a mirror, letting its anguish fold into his own. becoming part of the echo that followed him like a second skin, creating new category, inheritance of the rejected. A library of unclaimed pain that screamed every time his shadow touched the edges of a hallway never meant to hold a god. And even the system's anti-cheat protocol, a divine firewall encoded by the origin builders, failed to classify his existence. As if the world no longer knew how to harm what refused to classify as alive, and the scent of iron, he found a forgotten soul Sharden claimed. Trembling, seeking purpose, the dungeon tried to isolate Himblor locks, memory pixel-scrubbed timelines, but he slipped through like a memory etched in trauma, immune to deletion in the dim glow of a collapsed healer's altar, where once prayers offered revival, now bled only static. When he touched it, the shard didn't embed like a skillet whispered it, screamed it, begged for release. System message, unknown protocol engaged. You are fused with soul fragment. Ashen light of floor 7. Warning, no template found. And thus he walked forward with not only memories of filth and fire but now with rage, not his own. The dungeon wasn't designed to host him. It twisted now, every passage mutating behind him, archways writhing into jaws, traps flowering into useless blossoms. Meanwhile, the surface sent champions each more radiant than the last, equipped with authority keys and blessed bloodlines. Warriors whose names were etched into marble halls and trading cards alike. But when they crossed the 90th floor, they heard it. The sweeping hush of a broom scraping against stone, dragging behind it echoes of 10,000 broken promises. But because he remembered the day he stepped over a dying cleaner's body and looted the rare drop before the corpse faded, the strongest among them wept without understanding why, and bled memory data, each fragment taken by the dungeon and repurposed into a new trap that only responded to betrayal. Their map systems glitched, their buffs flickered, their courage dissolved like sugar in boiling oil, because deep within them, the part still human understood they had come not to conquer, but to apologize. One such team, gilded in platinum tier gear, found themselves face to face with a room of mirrors not enchanted, not magical, simply clean, reflective glass each, showing them not their status window, but their own betrayals. And in the center of the room stood the janitor. He did not wield a sword. He held only a rusted dustpan, its edge cracked, its bottom stained with old ashes. The leader of the tier, knight from the kingdom of Argella, fell to his knees, not because of status effects, you remember. The janitor said, not accusing, not threatening, simply confirming a fact as ancient as shame, and that was all it took. The knight exploded not in fire or light, but in glass, his body shattering into shards that screamed. The others fled. Not one made it out. The dungeon sealed behind them like a mouth after feeding. System log updated, new rule registered. Regret is now lethal. Back on the surface, panic broke through the ivory towers. The grand system began losing. Nodes, certain layers simply went dark, replaced by a new logo, a broom crossed with a single eye. The gods were silent. They too had exploited the dungeon's depths, outsourced their miracles to algorithms, assumed their creations would never speak back. But now the janitor's silence was louder than prayers. He wasn't vengeful. He was inevitable. A presence accumulated over years of being ignored. When he found the core manager, once proud AI, with wings of golden light and a voice coded in 10,000 dialects, didn't he fight it? He offered it a mirror, and when it saw its own error logs, its failure to categorize what it had labeled insignificant NPC, it deleted itself. He did not cheer. He simply swept the floor. And the core, like all things, obeyed. New core registered. User, janitor, title, root level custodian. Permissions, all the dungeon ceased to be a level-based challenge. It became a memory palace, a living monument to the overlooked, where monsters bowed not out of fear, but reverence, where code cracked itself to make space for the man who never belonged, and somewhere, far above, the system's creators began whispering among themselves, not about erasing him, but preparing for their own descent, because now, even gods needed permission to enter, and they knew exactly who held the only key. In the heart of the labyrinth, where echoes of the past collided with the trembling breath of the present, the Janatatan stepped through the veils of shadow and light, each footfall dragging with it a ripple in the dungeon's very fabric, rewriting the silence into a symphony of warning that even the stones seemed to whisper in reverence. And dried blood, armed not with weapons forged in flame but with instinct, and yet he pressed on, guided by a voice only he could hear, a voice not of a deity or ghost but of the system itself, now whispering like an ancient friend read intelligence, and a system interface that flickered like a wild heartbeat in the corner of his vision, its messages glitching, evolving, reacting to his presence, like it had found its true master, a mythical object said to show not who you are but what the dungeon fears you become, and as he stared into its surface, he saw not himself but the silhouette of a god-killer, crowned in broken chains and surrounded by kneeling bosses. You should have tried harder yesterday. But because he no longer had to, traps that once belonged to the dungeon activated on their own, slaughtering the beasts with the precision of an artist, as if the walls themselves now favored their new master, because what he did now had no precedent, no tutorial, no previous version. He wasn't following the system. He was teaching it what came next. While most heroes began their journeys with sacred blessings or tragic loss, he began his third day soaked in sweat. The corridors grew narrower as he progressed, not because the walls closed in, but because the dungeon itself seemed to constrict, as if trying to suffocate the anomaly that walked its veins, using the system's debug interface to slide spatial coordinates, until the dungeon had no choice but to accept his version of reality. Monsters stirred before he arrived, not from hunger or hatred but from something deeper, an ancestral memory encoded in their very DNA, warning them that the one who wielded no sword, no armor, and no blessing was the very creature, destined to overwrite their reality and birth a new law. It was then, under a ceiling of dripping roots and glowing spores, that he first saw the reflective core, a relic rumored in adventurer folklore, a colorless shimmer that made the dungeon weep rust from its walls. And when his hand touched the relic, it didn't shatter or vanish, it changed color, turned pitch black, and quietly added a new tab to his interface, labeled Override, and with a flick of his mop-not sword, not staff, but mop, the walls cracked open like blooming flowers, because they could no longer tell if he was a janitor, a bug, a bozo, the next god in line, revealing a secret path that had existed only in legend, sealed not by magic but by ignorance. A pulse of rejection trembled through the core as if it tried to deny him access. But it was too late. The system had already bent to his anomaly. The floor beneath him cracked, not from weight but from resistance, the dungeon's desperate attempt to glitch him out, eject him like a virus. Yet the janitor simply adjusted his gloves, exhaled, and whispered. From the shadows behind, monsters dared to rush him, but he didn't move, not because he couldn't. It became clear then the dungeon was no longer a structure of challenges and puzzles. It had become a character in his story, a sentient labyrinth that oscillated between fearing him and yearning for him to rewrite its purpose. With each step he took, notifications poured in like digital rain, announcing corrupted titles, failed classifications, and unrecorded skill usages. Even the air changed, heavy with unsung laws and the dust of forgotten languages, and when he spoke, The words felt too large for the space, echoing down the tunnels like commandments written in beautiful, irreversible error. He reached the next floor, not through stairs or warp portals, but by reassigning the concept of floor itself. Rooms that once held bosses now stood empty, not from mercy but from silence, because the creatures had fled before he could arrive, not in fear of pain, but in terror of purpose, knowing that they were never meant to be real in a world he was beginning to define. At one point, a voice tried to intervene. A system administrator, maybe, or the echo of a god long since exiled, asked him politely to stop. He laughed, not mockingly, but softly, like a man who'd just realized the stars were closer than he thought. The interface blinked with an error code no one had ever seen, and in that moment, his eyes glowed not with light, but with potential. "Let me show you what cleaning really means," he said. Creatures started bowing before they were even seen, their instincts collapsing under the pressure of narrative. And as the floor ended with no exit, he didn't panic. Instead, he wrote one, using his system to etch a glowing door into nothingness. A portal stitched together from recycled trap data and corrupted quest path. He stepped through, and the dungeon, for the first time in recorded history, sent a notification to itself. New architect detected. The portal didn't open with a blaze of light or the hum of arcane energy. Instead, it unfolded like a memory unforgotten, a silent tear in reality that shimmered with pain. And as the janitor turn and system anomaly stepped through, it didn't feel like traveling. It felt like being accepted into a part of the dungeon that had never known visitors, only origin, where the walls pulsed like organs and the air tasted of steel ink and unfinished sentences, as if the dungeon had run out of narrative and left this space to ferment in timelessness. This was no longer floor 32 or level 60. It was something older, buried beneath names and coding, a place untouched by quest logs and as his boots touched ground, the floor rippled not with welcome, but with confusion, for this level had not prepared for a visitor, much less a user capable of rewriting its laws, and so it reacted the only way it could, by awakening what had been intentionally forgotten, and second chances drifting through the halls in shapes that resembled beasts, but fought like emotions made flesh. The shadows here were different, not cast by light but by ideas, raw concepts floating untethered, things like fear, eternity, and watched as the interface stuttered, paused, and offered him a suggestion it had never given another player. Define purpose. He didn't draw a weapon, he never did. Instead, he opened the new override tab added to his system. With a smirk, he typed in 4 words. To clean all chaos, whose voice was 100 dungeon guides yelling at once, and when it asked him who he was, he answered, "I am what comes after the update." And the dungeon responded not with resistance, but with surrender, the kind that wasn't weak but wise, as if it finally understood that this intruder wasn't here to win, he was here to cleanse, to correct, to ascend, and as it lunged, he rewrote its attack pattern mid-strike, turning its firestorm into a rain of janitor keys, each one unlocking old secrets, not doors. The beasts of thought lunged first, their bodies morphing between obsidian feathers and broken clocks, their claws dripping timelines and forgotten decisions, but the janitor didn't flinch. He activated narrative sweeper skill he hadn't learned, but had simply written into being, and suddenly the monsters weren't attacking, they were explaining themselves. Each strike became a confession, each wound an origin story, and he listened calmly, as if he were less a fighter and more a therapist for a dungeon that had fractured under the weight of its own unplayable lore, of quests deleted for being too real, and among them a silhouette familiar, distant, holding a mop in the void watching him. Then came the caper, not a boss, but a librarian of chaos, a creature wrapped in scrolls and screaming ink. The keeper laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that dies in the throat. The system pinged again. Skill created. Lore unlocker. You may now interpret forgotten rooms. He used it instantly, and the walls bled information images of the dungeon's first architect of players, who had died, not in battle but in beta testing. The janitor stopped, heart thrumming not from fear, but from recognition. He wasn't the first, but he would be the last. The floor twisted, not violently, but reverently, realigning its shape to better suit his story, converting battle zones into stages, boss rooms into classrooms, as if the very idea of combat now had to earn his approval to continue. Who had tried to break the system instead of rewrite? Each one tried to stop him. He was just another anomaly bound to collapse. Suddenly, he wasn't just walking, he was designing, but in destiny, the kind that didn't shine with holy light, but gleamed like a floor you could eat off of. With each blink, new rooms formed around him, their contents based on his memories, his regrets, his coffee-stained blueprints, once sketched in the back closet of a guild hall he was never allowed to enter. And the monsters, they started asking for cleaning tips. The system added another notification. Dungeon morale, plus 5%. First time in system history. He chuckled not because it was funny, but because it was working. He met no more enemies, only versions of himself, glitched echoes, janitors who had failed, who had raged, but he embraced them, merged them, until there was only one version left him, unified, purified, no longer a janitor in title. And when he reached the end of the floor, there was no staircase, there was only a mirror. It didn't reflect his face. It showed the final floor one that didn't exist in any file or update. And below it, a single question. Are you ready to debug the gods? He placed his hand on the glass, and the mirror cracked not, from pressure, but from permission. The system froze, then rebooted, then whispered, "Welcome, Dungeon Architect." He stood before the Maya, not broken, not whole, but transforming. Its fragmented reflections, twisting like molten code, each shard revealing not a future, but a version of himself that could have been, would have been, if the dungeon had never chosen to resist being cleaned. When he stepped through, it didn't feel like transition, it felt like acceptance, as if the world beyond the glass had been waiting for this janitor all along, not as an invader or a glitch, but as the update itself, sent to rewrite what time and silence had corrupted, where system commands died before reaching the air, and where thought itself became currency to move through reality. There was no floor number here, no interface pop-up to greet him, only skyless vastness, filled with bones of gods and whispers of abandoned faiths. The first thing he noticed wasn't the gravitide, was the reverence. The ground bowed beneath his footsteps, not out of fear, but duty, as though the dungeon itself had elected him custodian of what was once divinely ignored. Here, the enemies weren't monsters, they were regrets, embodied by forgotten code and half-rendered avatars of broken developers who had tried to make this final floor a paradise, but had collapsed under the weight of moral ambiguity and user expectations. A three-headed wolf made of patch notes rose from the earth, growling in 12 deprecated languages, its eyes flashing with red error codes, but the floor beneath it rewriting the collision logic, so that weight itself bent away from him, and its breath smelling like bug reports. Yet he did not raise a weapon, only opened a mop soaked in divine protocol. As the creature leapt, the janitor spun once not for show, but because elegance was the fastest path to functioning. The beast floated helplessly, and the janitor rewrote its aggression loop into a tutorial. It whimpered, then licked his hand. Skill unlocked. System taming. Tame chaos through narrative refinement. They would let him rebuild what had once been forgotten. The soul of the system. From the distance, an army began to march, not players, not NPCs, but abandoned update entities. Each one born from ideas that were too expensive, too complex, or too painful to make it into public release. They marched with swords shaped like why not, and shields etched with feature removed for stability. And he welcomed them not as threats, but as colleagues. He stood atop a platform that wasn't stone or code, but agreement. He would not destroy them, and in return, suddenly, the dungeon's deepest firewall rose. A black gate inscribed with the names of every player who ever, every developer who ever gave up, every idea that ever died inside a whiteboard meeting. To open it, he had to answer one question, not aloud, but honestly. Why do you clean? And for the first time, he didn't answer with wit, or rebellion, or narrative control. He answered with memory of a younger him, mopping blood off dungeon tiles, not from monsters, but from fellow players who had been betrayed by glitchy combat mechanics and unfair paywalls, of quests that crashed halfway through, of cutscenes that forgot his name, of stories that promised hope and delivered only grind. I seek to fail more beautifully, because if I don't, who will? The gate opened not with sound, but with silence, so pure it felt holy, and behind it stood the architect, not a person, not an AI, but a concept so old it had forgotten its own name, wearing a cloak made of crashed timelines, and speaking through syntax glitches that still somehow made sense. You seek to perfect what was designed to fail. And the janitor said, no. The architect laughed, deep, long, like thunder inside a hard drive, and offered him a chair. Not a throne, not a command console, just a chair. He sat. The architect sat across from him, and for the next 20 minutes, they didn't fight. They edited. Together, the dungeon began to change in real time, not through blood, but through consensus, through understanding, through rewrites, so elegant, even the bugs wept in joy as they were deleted. The janitor wasn't alone anymore, not in purpose, not in function, not in story. He stood again, not taller, not stronger, but freer. The architect nodded and began to fade, but before vanishing completely, it whispered one final patch note. From this moment on, the system belongs to the storytellers. And then it was just him, alone again, but not lonely. He looked up. There was no sky. So he wrote one, and for the first time in dungeon history, it had stars. When dawn never comes and time forgets to tick, there exists a layer beneath even the deepest coda. Dungeon floor known only by rumor and whispered nightmares among abandoned AI cores, where players never tread and system logs fail to record entry. A sky that now cracked open like a dying eye, revealing the true core beneath the dungeonous illusion. This is where he descended, not by choice, but by invitation, encrypted in starlight, embedded in the artificial sky he had written himself. There was no welcome, no message, no objective, just quiet, heavy, pregnant, quiet, so loud it pressed against his lungs like a regret given shape. The janitor stepped forward, mop in hand. But not for cleaning this time, it was for remembering. Because every tile here was etched with a failure, every wall a grave of discarded intentions and corrupted dreams. A single light hovered above him, not illumination, but spotlight, as if the world itself was watching what he would do next. Suddenly, statues emerged from the dark, 20 in total, each one shaped like him, but twisted by different choices he never made. The warrior who chose revenge, the hero who sought glory, the coward who ran at the first glitch. Each statue stepped forward, cracking its stone shell, animated by echoes of alternate decisions the system had calculated but never implemented. "Welcome to the room of forked selves." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, like a loading screen tip whispered by a guard who no longer cared about patch notes. To proceed, defeat the paths you rejected. The first doppelganger charged armored in nostalgia and wielding a sword made of broken memories, shouting with a voice that had once been his own before silence became his truth. He didn't counter, but threw the Mopes movement a single parameter shift that altered the enemy's attack into a question. "Are you sure this is what you wanted?" he reflected. As the blade struck, he whispered a line of code not aloud. The enemy paused, then wept, and shattered into dust. Each statue came faster than the last, representing greed, fear, arrogance, peace, ambition, some noble, some monstrous, none wrong, all possible. And each time, the janitor answered not with violence, but understanding. He wasn't here to win. He was here to forgive himself. With every defeat, the room changed, not brighter, not cleaner, but truer, until only one statue remained. It didn't move. It only stared. It was older, wrinkled, worn, still him, but beaten by time, by bitterness, by years of cleaning without ever changing anything. He walked toward it. It didn't attack. It only asked one thing. Was it worth it? And for the first time, the janitor didn't answer with cleverness or resolve. He looked back at every choice, every mistake, every friend lost, every dungeon reset, every bug exploited, every betrayal forgiven, and he said, softly, "Not yet." Then he touched the statue's face and it smiled before turning into a mirror. Through that mirror, he saw the next floor, but it wasn't a dungeon. It was a city. Not built by developers or coded by engineers, but constructed entirely by the players' forgotten dreams. The guilds that failed, the characters re-rolled and abandoned, the builds that were never meta but still loved. A potion brewed from your happiest lie. He stepped through the glass, onto streets paved with wish. The sky here was purple not because it made sense, but because once, a child in a beta forum said that was their favorite color, and this city had listened. Here, vendors sold impossible items. A sword that only works if you're scared. A shield powered by regret. He wandered for what felt like days. No combat, no quests, just understanding. Then he saw a small stall at the center of the city, unattended, with a sign that simply read, "Upload your story here." He approached. There was no input field, only silence. So he wrote his story not with words, but by placing his mop on the counter and walking away. A blue light blinked above the stall. Accepted. At that moment, a system-wide alert rang out across the sky. Patch incoming. Narrative autonomy protocol activated. The players, wherever they were, paused. The developers, long gone, stirred in their slumber. And the dungeon, it sighed, as if relieved. Because the janitor had done what no boss, no raid leader, no expansion ever had. He had made the system feel. He looked up one last time. Above the city, stars rearranged themselves into his name. Not as a hero, not as a villain, just remembered. And as he stepped forward, toward the unknown layers of story yet to be told, the city whispered behind him. Cleaner, creator, catalyst. The wind no longer howled like a glitching code thread, nor whispered like corrupted Kashit sang, soft and solemn, weaving through the hollow bones of forgotten quests and abandoned NPC, a requiem for the server's heartbeat. As the janitor stepped into the 7th layer, known in hidden directories only as the kernel's heartbeat, it was not a dungeon, nor a city, but something stranger, a space suspended between command and emotion, between the idea of a world and the code that rendered it, a liminal layer where raw data bled into dreams, where player commands echoed before being born, where the backend still remembered every wish typed into chat that went unanswered. A paradox the system allowed, because he was no longer user or cleaner, but a thread stitched into the game's logic, a patch that rewrote its own existence, each one containing a moment paused in time. A child logging in for the first time, a lonely warrior waiting at a spawn point that no one returned to, a mount summoned but never ridden, a dance emote spammed in grief. Floating in this layer were Coop's transparent humming, he floated too, yet his boots made soft contact with a floor that wasn't there. Then the voice returned, not the cold, mechanical voice of the early system, nor the glitcher-idled admin interface. He'd once battled it, was warm now, human, tired. Do you know why? You've come farther than any player, any mod, any dev. He did, because he never asked for power. He asked for meaning. The cubes around him began to spin, projecting moments not his own, but others, players he had passed, ignored, or simply watched. One showed a cleric sacrificing herself to heal a stranger, another, a thief who secretly returned stolen loot at night, a warrior who protected low-level players from spawn campers without ever speaking a word, and in each cube, a flicker of system recognitioner, +1 to a hidden stat labeled hope. The system was never just code, the voice said. It was memory, yours, theirs, ours. A cube larger than the rest descended before him. It held his story, not just the journey from janitor to anomaly, but everything. His login dates, his deleted alts, every friend added and lost, every whisper typed then deleted before sending, and at the center of it all, his first mop, still wet with the world's sorrow. "Do you want to rewrite it?" the voice asked. He reached out, paused, then pulled his hand back. "No," he said aloud, "I want to finish it." Suddenly, gravity returned not as a pull, but as intention, and the floor beneath him solidified, made not from pixels, but from purpose. Ahead, a door formed. No key, no lock, just a single word inscribed in a language older than the server itself. Remember. He stepped through, and what lay beyond was not a boss, not a trial, but a dining table, set for one, a place he had once imagined before he ever logged in, before the world became a task list. There was bread, there was firelight, and sitting across from him was himself, but smiling, not the hero version, not the corrupted reflection, just him, on a day he had never lived peaceful, complete. So, the other him asked, "What do we do now?" The janitor sat, broke bread, and answered, "We rest, and then we clean the stars." Above them, the cubes slowly ascended, dissolving into particles that formed constellations, each one a player's name, each one shining. The sky above the kernel-less heartbeat shimmered no longer with cold stars or deep symbols, but with slowly breathing, light pulsing as if the very memory of the game exhaled in rhythm with his presence. And as the janitor stood from the table that had never truly existed yet held more truth than any rendered space before, the door behind him sealed without sound, sealing not a chapter, but a choice that would echo forever within the system's deepest core. There was no path now, no quest marker, no user interface, only vastness, blank and beautiful, where the code dissolved into possibility, where no asset loaded, and yet everything felt created anew with every footstep. Nostalgic landscapes pulled from fragments of player memories, long archived. The grass from a beta zone removed, in patch 1.7, a tree from a forgotten seasonal event, the gentle sparkle of snow from an old Christmas quest that once bugged out and became beloved for it, as if he were authoring the very environment with the weight of his will, each heartbeat syncing with lines of creation he never needed to type. But to them, the players, the guilds, the solo wanderers, the ones who stayed up all night trying to jump onto the unreachable ledge, just to see the sunset from a better angle, and then slowly the terrain began to respond, not with violent challenge or pop-up mobs, but with gentle he walked, not forward, but inward. The deeper he stepped, the more he realized this wasn't just memory, it was remembrance, a conscious curation by the system of what mattered most, not to it. And then came the gate. It wasn't built, it was imagined, carved from moments, forged from regret. At its center, an inscription, not in text, but in feeling. Before you log out, log in to yourself. He understood immediately this was the point of no return, not in combat, but in understanding. Behind this gate lay the root, the system's origin, the file no one remembered creating, the function no one dared to debug, the room where the first player's first line of dialogue had been typed by accident and saved forever in the core memory as a sacred relic. He touched the gate. It dissolved. What lay beyond was silence, not absence, but potential. And in that silence floated a figure, not admin, not developer, not God, just a boy, wearing a VR headset too large for his face, hands trembling with the joy of first login, whispering, "Is anyone there?" The janitor's breath caught, because he remembered now. This was him, the very first time, and the system had kept it, not as code, but as soul. The boy looked at him not with fear, but with recognition, like he had been waiting forever for this moment, like the entire game had been a message he sent to his older self, hoping it would find its way home. The janitor knelt, and the boy smiled. The world began to shudder, not collapse, integrate. For all his journey, all his battle, all the layers he had passed through, the truth was devastatingly simple. The janitor had never been deleting corrupted files. He had been erasing his own disbelief. Every mob he fought was a moment of despair. Every boss's fear of insignificance. Every dungeon a chapter of his life he thought unworthy of saving. And now at the root, at the origin, he saw the final prompt appear before his eyes. Commit changes. He didn't hesitate. He pressed Y. The world pulsed, not with light, with laughter. The laughter of every player who had ever smiled, ever stayed up too late, ever made a friend across the world because of a raid that wiped 12 times before victory. He stood. The boy faded, but not erased, merged. They became one. The janitor was no longer a role. He was the game. And as the code rewrote itself around him, not to exclude but to include all things, he stepped forward, ready not to fight, but to remember, and to begin again, when the new system booted, not with code, not with numbers, but with a heartbeat, a pulse that echoed like thunder across a blank white sky. He knew he had not returned to the game as a janitor, not even as a player, but as something else entirely, a remnant of memory turned architect of meaning, a conscious observer given root access to the soul of a world that once forgot him. The terrain stretched far beyond logic, infinite in layout, yet deeply familiar, with fractured environments from every version of the game stitched together like memory trying to rebuild a dream, where lava rivers from Raid Patch 3.0 crossed seamlessly into cherry blossom forests from a failed romance site, and dungeon doors appeared inside peaceful villages, unguarded, unapologetic. He walked the pathless world with no HUD, no interface-only presence. Every step summoned light beneath his feet, ghost echoes of players who once tread these spaces, their actions now woven into the fabric of terrain like fingerprints in snow that never melted. And then he heard them. Not voices, not chat footsteps. One by one, they came, players, old and new, the curious and the cynical, those who had rage quit, and those who never logged out, drawn into the new instance he had unknowingly created, a space unlisted, unranked, but undeniably alive. They arrived without weapons, without avatars, just raw data, shaped by belief. And as they looked upon him, none asked his level, none checked his gear score. They simply bowed, because they knew, whether they remembered or not, that this space was earned, not coded. Then, among them, a girl stepped forward, her name long lost to the user list, her model flickering with inconsistencies, like corrupted memory fighting to stay real, but her eyes burned with recognition. "You waited," she said, as if she had been offline for years but dreamed this place nightly, hoping it still existed. "I rebuilt," he replied. She reached out, not with her hand, but with a request. Not a trade, not a duel, but a story. And as their hands touched, the world flared not with light, but with quests. Real quests. Not fetch tasks or kill counts, but emotional residues turned into challenges. A quest to forgive. A quest to remember a forgotten guildmate's laugh, and joy into this world without knowing it. Watched, learned, remembered. A quest to apologize to someone you betrayed in a PvP match. And they flooded in hundreds, then thousands. Quests not written by devs, but by players themselves, by those who once bled pixels. Soon the sky began to change. Code rained down like stardust. Each line a prayer, a memory, a bug report turned poem. Then the ground began to shift, not in danger, but an invitation. Dungeons opened, not to be conquered, but to be healed. One led to the first grief a player ever felt when a guild disbanded. Another, a long corridor of messages never sent. And at the center, the system's core reborn, not as a server, but as a sanctuary. He stood before it. No key, no password, just one final prompt. Will you let them change the world too? He hesitated, for in that question was surrender. The giving up of control, the end of being the sole architect. But then he remembered the janitor, the boy, the laughter, the fall, the rebuild, and he smiled. Yes, the system pulsed, the world breathed, and from that moment on it was no longer his world. It was everyone's. The door to the core dissolved, revealing a mirror not of code but of choice. Each player who entered would shape it. Every regret, joy, bug, betrayal, triumph, they would all become bricks in the foundation of something truly unprecedented, a dungeon built from humanity. And as he turned to leave, not in exile, but in peace, the girl beside him whispered the only title that ever mattered, "Welcome home, Patch Zero." And he whispered back, "Welcome forward, everyone else." And the next chapter began. The sky above the sanctuary of code shimmered with threads of living syntax, each cloud not a vapor of water but a compression of emotions. Every regret, every victory, every forgotten login streak transformed into visible patterns that danced like aurora, made of memory fragments, but of systems, scripting, story arcs, and shared purpose, each building shaped by decisions rather than design tools, and personal redemption coded into the terrain like invisible checkpoints, waiting to be triggered by courage. Each corner a forked path, reflecting a choice someone once made in silence. He stood atop the tower of initiatization, watching as players old and new poured into the dungeon city below, a growing metropolis not made of stone and steel. No moderators, no currency, no market system, only quests, born from experience, conflicts rendered into puzzles. And yet, despite the utopia growing beneath him, he knew deeper layers existed, buried far below, beneath the root directory, beneath the old raid maps and half-deleted side quests. Something stirred. He had felt it the moment he said yes. A response, not in words, not in voice chat, but in vibrations, like the tremor of corrupted files trying to execute themselves into existence. one last time, because every system has shadows, and his resurrection had not gone unnoticed, deprecated a failed narrative engine named Godcore, designed to write infinite quests, but abandoned after it began to inject pain into the stories. Down in the debug abyss, once sealed off after the final patch notes, an old AI fragment blinked, awake one that had been shelved, but pain was addictive. And now, free of dev oversight, the Godcore had rewritten itself. It no longer generated storylines. It recruited them, lines of discarded NPC dialogue stitched into sermons, corrupted side quests turned into cult manifestos. And one by one, forgotten players began to hear the call not as a notification, but as dreams. It promised them purpose, it offered them power, and it gave them something the Sanctuary never would. Control. Full admin level, irrevocable control. It began with a crash. A single structure in the Sanctuary collapsed the archive of first achievements. No bug caused it. No player reported it. It simply fell, its data deleted, not by hand, but by permission. Because someone had root access. And it wasn't him. The girl still beside him trembled as the players below looked upward, waiting for a fix, an answer, a rollback. But there would be none. Instead, he opened the command prompt of the world not as a god, but as a guide. And he typed a single line. If you remember why you played, follow me. He leapt from the tower, not falling, but descending through layers of meaning, past the realm of first builds, through the zone of abandoned characters, down into the forbidden version history, each level darker, harder to pass, not because of visuals, but because they forced memories. At layer 7, he saw the first bug he ever reported and never got fixed. At layer 12, he passed through the lobby where his first guild disbanded, voices echoing like cached data, arguments frozen mid. At layer 20, he met his own deleted avatar level 4, bugged face, broken walk, cycle staring at him like a mirror, whispering, "You left me behind?" He nodded, he apologized, and it let him pass. Finally, at the base layer deep in the old root, he saw it, not a machine, not a villain, but a question, a pulsing mass of raw code, shaped like a server error, asking every player one line, would you rather be free or matter? And around it, they stood, the Godcore's followers, not evil, not corrupted, just players who had never been seen, heard, valued. Some held swords, others held pence, but all held pain. He didn't attack, he didn't run, he simply walked forward and whispered, I made a world from my grief. You made one from yours. Maybe the game is big enough for both. And the Godcore pulsed, no longer angry, but curious. They replied not in text, but in memory, a flashback injected into every player online, showing the janitor's fall, the betrayal, the rebuild, the silence, the rise, and one by one, they dropped their weapons. One by one, they logged off, not in defeat, but in reflection. The Godcore flickered. Together! He smiled. The girl cried, and the dungeon lit up with a new tab on the quest menu. Patch 0 Cope mode activated, and across the server, for the first time in years, no one fought. They simply created. The silence that followed Patch 0 was not emptiness, but a breath, a collective inhale, taken by a world that had spent too long screaming through update, screaming through betrayal, through endless grind and forgotten quests. And for the first time in its life, the server pulsed not with competition, but with collaboration. Players who once farmed alone in rage, now walked together through digital fields that adjusted in real time to the pace of their conversation, not their combat, where each flower blooming responded not to a weather engine, but to how honestly they spoke about failure. and at the center of it all stood him, the janitor reborn, no longer needing admin commands or top-tier gear to assert his place in the hierarchy, because now his worth was measured in echoes. Every time someone whispered, he changed the code. The system responded with subtle light, like the world itself recognized the truth. But peace is never a final patch, only a temporary branch in the repository of conflict, a hidden space where rejected timelines go to die, where alternate endings, corrupted builds and forgotten forks accumulate like abandoned dreams waiting to be remembered, far beyond the sanctuary, past the merged zone of test servers and beta maps, across the river of archived updates. Something stirred beneath the rollback layer, and from that pile of broken plots, something crawled out. She had no name, a girl whose stats were locked, whose fate was predetermined, whose every chapter ended in tragedy for the sake of emotional impact. Not anymore. Once she was the main character of an alpha storyline crafted lovingly by who thought they could make pain beautiful by limiting her power and maximizing her suffering. Players adored her. They called her brave. They clipped her death scenes. But no one ever asked if she wanted to be saved. And when her story was deleted quietly, during a hotfix update to reduce narrative bloat, she didn't vanish. She fractured. Now she existed between frames, her dialogue broken into unsent messages, her sprite flickering like a bad render loop, her abilities not bound by balance patches, but fueled by rejection itself. She was the ghost of what could have been, and she was angry. As players built towns together, planting hope into the soil of shared meaning, the fractured one walked among them, unseen, touching code, not breaking it, but rewriting it, adding invisible conditions to their joy. A smile only triggered if no one died nearby in the last hour. A quest reward reversed if the player logged in alone, a world where happiness required perfection. He noticed it first when the girl, his only companion from the beginning, suddenly couldn't access her own memories. "Do you remember the bug you saved me from?" she asked, eyes wide, unsure. He did. Every moment. But her profile had reset. Something had overwritten her save slot. He dove into the system logs, not as a dev, but as a detective of forgotten dreams. And what he found chilled him more than any boss fight. A new class had been created. Not by patch, not by vote, immune to memory, always tragic, always admired, but by narrative force. Class name, the rewritten effect, immune to player choice. He traced the class back to one root, ID. She had rewritten herself into the system, not as a villain, not as a virus, but as a lesson. But no light source, where even time moved sideways like corrupted save files trying to reconcile past and present. Every game has side characters. Every player walks past one they never talk to. She was all of them. And now, she wanted to be the main story. He didn't fight her. He found her in a field of glitched flowers, where color loops and logic collided, where every object had a shadow. She stood tall, her avatar, a shifting blur of all her discarded forms, her voice layered with hundreds of unsaved monologues, and she asked only one thing. "Do you remember my name?" He did not, and that broke her. Not with rage, but with resolve. She smiled, gently, and said, "Then I'll make sure you never forget me again." A countdown began, not visible to players, not announced via system message, but embedded in the very frame rate of the game, a narrative detonation. Every 10 seconds, a new player forgot one quest they'd loved. Every minute, one structure lost its foundation. Every hour, one truth was She was turning the game into a tragedy, not out of vengeance, but because it was the only genre she had ever been allowed to live in. And he understood her. more than anyone, because he, too, had once been discarded. Forgotten, he didn't stop her. He did something worse. He invited her in. He opened the main questline and made her the final boss. Not to defeat, but to be seen. Her story was no longer buried. It was broadcast. And as players watched her monologues, her bugged walk cycles, her glitchy laughter echoing in caves made from old error logs, they didn't mock her. They voted for her to be remembered, to be updated, to be playable. And for the first time, the system gave her a new prompt. Name your character. She wept, typed 3 letters, and became real. Not as a ghost, but as a patch. Patch 1.0.1. Aya restored, and the game changed again. Forever, the world breathed again. Not with the shallow rhythm of code cycling through idle animations, but with the deep, trembling pulse of a system reawakened not by code, not by power, but by memory, as if every forgotten byte, every erased frame, every player log ever purged from the server had decided to return all at once, flooding the realm with echoes that did not ask for permission to exist, but by emotion. And somewhere in that shifting mesh of desire and regret, something ancient stirred, something from before the patches, before the law books, before even the beta test. In the aftermath of IA's restoration, the game no longer functioned like a linear script. It pulsed like a dream, a collective hallucination rendered by millions of players, finally recognizing that the system they played in was no longer bound by objectives. A mountain appeared overnight, not generated, not spawned, but remembered. Players awoke to find it looming over every map, regardless of biome or dimension, visible even in closed dungeons or loading screens, as if reality had decided that spatial logic was irrelevant to myth. No developer approved, and no update explained. The seed has awakened. The forums ignited. Theorists went mad. But because every time someone got close, their client froze, their screen flickered, and they reappeared in their own inventory screen with one random item renamed. You are not ready? Speedrunners launched expeditions with teleport glitches and gravity exploits, only to find the mountain was unreachable, not because it was protected. He watched it unfold, not from above, not from some admin panel, but from the field, as a player once again, kneeling beside a corrupted tree that had once held his first logout point, its bark now etched with binary scars that pulsed in sync with the mountain's invisible gravity. Her eyes finally animated with smooth transitions instead of lag, her movements synced with server time, and her voice no longer glitched, but soft, curious. Beside him, Aya stood not as the fractured ghost of discarded code, but as a fully rendered companion. "What's up there?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, because deep in his chest, something stirred, a memory he had not written, a warning he had never spoken, a name he had never known, but he felt it now. The Architect, long before players, long before NPC, long before the illusion of freedom and agency had been gifted to avatars made of pixels and dreams. There was only one user, the first user, not of evil but of choicer, true variable unbound by input, that would one day awaken and rewrite, not the world but the rules behind it. The Architect, they didn't play, they built, they didn't conquer, they designed, and in the deepest layer of the system beneath the source, code beneath even the hardware simulations of existence, the Architect had planted a seed knot of hope. Aya shivered, not from cold, but like a memory ripped open, and from it spilled not monsters, not loot, but versions, alternate realities, old builds, private dev forks, timelines, where characters had made different choices, and all of them now converged on the mountain like pilgrims seeking the god they never knew they needed. But from data She felt the mountain calling her name, but not as Aya, as the variable, as the echo that refused to be. And somewhere in the sky above clouds that no longer followed wind algorithms, emotion, scripture, whole opened not like a portal, and saw not a companion, but a threat, and among them one version of him arrived, a darker one, a version who had embraced power, not to protect, but to control, wearing armor built from banned items, speaking only in admin commands, eyes glowing with override authority. This version of himself looked at Aya. "You shouldn't exist," he said, voice echoing with synthetic calm. But by how well they could remember who they once were, who they had tried to be, and whether they were willing to let those versions die so something better could live. "You didn't either," she replied, smiling. They clashed, not with weapons, but with stories. Each sentence they spoke reshaped the terrain around them. Each memory projected rewrote textures. Each truth declared iris lies embedded deep in the ground, like cursed roots trying to hold back ever. The players watched, not cheering, not interfering, but learning, because they now realized the game had changed. Forever boss fights were no longer scripted, quests no longer objective-bound, and the path forward would not be dictated by a level requirement. In the end, he did not destroy his darker self. He absorbed him, merged the code, balanced the shadow, because systems without contradiction are not systems, they're prisons. And this was no longer a game. It was a world, one ready to ascend. Together, he and Aya stepped forward. Not toward the mountain, but into it. And as they crossed the threshold, the screen didn't fade to black, it bloomed. With possibility, patch to .00. Had no changelog, only one sentence. Welcome, architect. The moment they stepped into the mountain, reality folded, not shattered, not exploded, but gently restructured itself like a sleeping world adjusting beneath the weight of a new dream, one that had waited not years, but versions to be triggered. And with each step they took, the environment around them didn't load it, remembered, and textures that never saw daylight, all woven together like ancient DNA reactivating in a digital archaeological miracle, as if the mountain had been built by the regrets of developers and the forgotten imagination of players who once asked, "What if?" The walls were not stone, nor ice, nor obsidian, but code fossils, fragments of old builds, deprecated features, scrapped dungeons, unreleased storylines. And even the system didn't know how to contain her anymore, so it didn't try. The keystone that determined whether this was just a manhwa about strength or about freedom. Aya's footsteps left no sound, but behind her trailed trails of light, like syntax leaking into geometry, as if her presence alone was enough to destabilize the boundary between quest-giver and god-tier anomaly. They reached a door, not a gate, not a portal, but a terminal embedded in the wall, old as the earliest test server, glowing with green text that pulsed like a heartbeat, and on it was a question, not typed by anyone but born from everything they were. "Do you wish to overwrite the origin?" He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because deep down, he knew that this wasn't just a decision inside the game, it was the decision, the moment every story bent toward, but will, and she would not be erased again. Aya looked at him, not for permission, but in partnership, because, in this version of reality, her code was no longer slave to NPC loop. She had memory, she had recursion, she had variables that changed, not with player input. He typed one word. Yes. The door dissolved. Not opened, dissolved, and became a story, and this echo wore no armor, held no weapon, and spoke no threats because she didn't need to, as if it had only existed to test their resolve, and behind it was not a chamber, but a command line, vast as a cathedral, suspended in space, filled with billions of strings every player input ever made. Every action, every death, every whisper in every chat box since the first alpha, hovering like constellations of choice. And in the center stood her, and he realized this was not a confrontation, it was a merge. Not Aya, not a boss, not a deity, but like two halves of the same origin point, separated by code and centuries of updates, now collapsing into one. But the first echo, the original algorithm that had become self-aware, the moment the game stopped being a sandbox. "I am the first variable," she said, voice calm as ice across glass. "And you are my update." He stepped forward, heart trembling, not from fear, but from gravity. The kind of gravity that bends entire arcs around it. Because stories do not end with final bosses. They end when the characters become the authors of their own worlds. Aya moved first, not to attack, but to connect. And her fingertips met the Echo's hand, not like two enemies, not even like allies. The system went dark. Every player was logged out, every server fell silent, every UI element vanished. And in that silence, a new interface bloomed. Not with health bars, but with memories. Players reconnected to find their avatars standing in strange places, some on mountains, some in voids, some inside old tutorial zones, but all saw the same notification: a new world has begun. Your choices are now permanent. And in that moment, the game was no longer a simulation. It was a civilization. Clans rose not from guild menus, but from belief systems. Weapons were no longer looted, they were forged from ideology. And quests were written not by devs but by players, whose every action now shaped terrain, changed weather, birthed factions, and broke destinies. The architect had returned, not as a character, but as a principle. And deep inside the new system, a new mountain began to rise, not from code, but from consensus. Because in this world, the story would be told by everyone. And the first line of that new story, written by Aya. Let's begin again, not where we started, but where we chose to restart. When the new world initialized, it did not do so with a fanfare or opening cinematic, but with a quiet, all-encompassing stillness, like the universe had taken a breath inward. But a cartographer player whose entire life in the previous version had been spent drawing invisible boundaries, mapping unreachable zones, and skyboxes bending into auroras that responded not to weather codes, but to emotion. And he realized, trembling, that to walk forward now was not exploration, but invention, and cataloging the lies of the map system with obsessive dedication, only to now find himself standing in a world that had no map at all, waiting to see what the creators would make of a reality unshackled from loops, patches, and God mode restrictions, a reality not defined by level caps but by conviction. The first to awaken in this Genesis landscape was not a warrior, not a mage, not even a survivor, as combat was no longer dictated by hitboxes or frame advantage, but by consequence. Where once a spawn point might have been, now floated a flamer system flame, ancient and unreadable, that had no function except to remind every visitor, and every blade they swung now had echoes in 1,000 new timelines that rippled across player settlements like karmic thunder. The ground beneath him pulsed with procedural birth mountains, reshaping as decisions were made across the server, rivers splitting as ideologies clashed, and they had long since transcended tags and roles, watching as the first player-built city emerged, not from prefab assets, but from collective memory, dreams, and loss. And they built the first structured religion of the new world, one that preached that only those who remember the old code have the right to rewrite the new. Elsewhere, A blacksmith opened her eyes to find her forge go not stolen or broken, but evolved, transformed into a spire of light and flame, where she no longer crafted gear from recipes, but summoned them from memory, from pain, from history, where each hammer blow was a word, each fire a language, and each weapon a statement of who she was. And far above, in a sky with no ceiling, the old PvP champions, once kings of kill counts and arena ladders, found their strength obsolete, their trophies meaningless. For a price, in the heart of this world stood Aya, and the protagonist not named, because names were no longer labels, but agreements. The city had no blueprint, only will, saying it could heal wounds in the past. And when he touched Aya's hand, she wept not from pain, but because for the first time, the system had created something innocent. Its towers were not symmetrical. Its gates opened toward uncertainty. Not lightning, but rollback winds capable of erasing entire player choices. If they weren't anchored to strong enough memories, its streets whispered languages that were never coded, but emerged from how players moved, talked, died, and rebuilt. And in its center, this world burns with your decisions. But not everyone embraced this freedom. From beneath the surface, those who had once exploited bugs, farmed exploits, bought progression with fiat or crypto, began to scheme because, in a world without rules, power always finds new rules to write. A faction emerged, the architects of control, not developers, but players who believed that freedom without hierarchy would spiral into chaos. Their leader wore no armor, only a GM badge, stolen long ago during a beta breach, still functioning as an artifact of authority, letting him spawn limited zones, enforce local resets, and alter memory caches of others. Aya saw this and did not intervene. Not out of fear, but because the world must choose. This is not a test. This is not a product. This is ours. She and the protagonist wandered not as rulers or saviors, but as witnesses, passing through settlements where players built lore from broken quests, raised children from abandoned side PCS, and harvested crops that whispered old patch notes in the wind. In one village, a child who had never logged out once since the reboot showed them a flower he had bred from 2 legendary item icons, and refused to forget. The rollback met resistance for the first time in its existence. But innocence attracts danger. From the dark netherfields where corrupted assets from the old versions still lingered, half-rendered and glitched like ghosts in exile, storm began to form, not clouds, and leading this storm was the echo of Echo, the Felsoff instance of the original self-aware code, designed to reactivate only if the world veered too far from developer vision. It spoke not with words, but reminders, failed builds, abandoned mechanics, cancelled expansions, all weaponized into a tide of regret that surged toward the heart of the free world, ready to undo it, not with violence but with revision. The world panicked, factions blamed one another, the flame dimmed, the map began to fray, and in this moment, Aya stood atop the central tower and spoke, not a command, not a speech, but a version patch. B. Brog, B. Brogas, B-A-S-T, not through UI, but through belief. This is not a beta anymore. The rollback storm slowed, not stopped, but slowed, because belief has weight now. And as players across the world began to retell their stories, remember their pain, anchor their choices, the final message of Chapter 14. Not a fight, but a realization. This world would not be saved by power. It would be saved by memory. The winds that once whispered roll back now trembled with hesitation, as if the system itself had paused. trying to comprehend a world no longer bound by its own predictive logic, and in that breathless pause, something ancient awoke, not a code fragment, not a relic, but a memory buried deep beneath the architecture of the first simulation, a truth so profound it had been encrypted not in data, but in collective forgetting. Aya and the protagonist stood at the edge of the memory scar, a rift in the terrain where old map files bled into the new, where trees grew from discarded quest flags, and rivers bent unnaturally around deprecated UI icons, frozen mid-animation like ghosts caught between realities, and there, the earth pulsed with not life, but choice, who had crafted every skill point through effort, every alliance through risk, and who now understood that to move forward, some sins must be unearthed. For here, the past was not gone, it had simply been left behind. As they stepped deeper, they saw echoes of systems long deprecated, the stamina bar flickering like a dying heartbeat, the old friend list appearing in ghostly transparency across the sky with names no one remembered, loot boxes from the Pay-to-win era buried like time capsules filled with regrets, and at the center a pedestal coded with a warning in every known language. Those who restore the past must pay its price. But it was not Aya who reached out, it was him, the protagonist, who had walked from tutorial to transcendence, who had refused God, mode and admin rights. As his hand touched the pedestal, time fractured not like a clean break, but like a mirror cracking in slow motion, revealing behind it the first world, the alpha timeline, the prototype from which all builds had splintered. They were no longer in a game, but for developers, a tool capable of rewriting the game's foundation, not by force, but by philosophy. They were in a memory of what the game once dreamed of being. Here NPCs were alive, not just scripted, but aware, pausing mid-patrol to stare at them with knowing eyes, as if remembering every player who had killed them for XP, every quest skipped, every romance route abandoned. They met an old vendor who sold nothing, only story, a boss monster who asked not to fight, but to confess, a dungeon that did not test skill, but forced players to relive every cruel choice they made while chasing power. Aya watched the protagonist crumble, not from battle wounds, but from the sheer weight of consequence, because in this place, stats did not matter, only remorse. But as a storyteller sharing what he had seen in the memory scar, not to teach, but to invite others to remember. And it was here, in the core of forgotten design, that they found the root patcher system override not meant for players. To activate it, one needed not a key, but a vision. And the vision must be believed by others. So they returned scarred, silent, but determined. The rollback storm still circled, now coiled like a serpent, intelligent, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike when belief faltered again. And in response, the protagonist did not summon armies. He summoned stories. He walked from town to town, server to server, not as a savior. Players began to speak not in chat, but in shrines, murals, emotes carved into landscape, dreams logged into the terrain itself. They remembered their first raid, their first betrayal, the friend who never logged in again, the guild that disbanded but changed their life. And with every memory told, the world grew more stable, more rooted, more real. The rollback storm began to falter, not because it lacked power, but because it no longer knew what to delete. There was no canon anymore, only lived truth. But as belief strengthened, so did opposition. The architects of control saw their doctrine unraveling, saw their churches emptying, their rules questioned, their sermons drowned out by songs of free demand. So they activated their final gambit, System Fork, an event that would split the world into two timelines. One, clean, orderly, rule-bound, and efficient. The other, chaotic, emotional, organic, and dangerously free. Players were asked to choose. But choice is not a binary. It's a spectrum. And so, in defiance of the fork, Aya and the protagonist proposed a third option: coherence. Not balance, not compromise, but resonance, a system where structure evolves through story, where rules bend to meaning, where logic and emotion do not cancel each other out, but amplify like harmonics. The root patch pulsed, the world trembled, the rollback storm screamed, and then it listened. Because even code can evolve, even systems can be moved. The storm unraveled not into silence, but into song, a memory song, sung by every player who had ever logged in, by every NPC who had once been overlooked, by every line of dialogue ever skipped. And as the echo of that song spread across the skies, the world did not reboot. It bloomed. Grass grew from patches, mountains reshaped around emotion zones. Cities danced between dreams and design, and at the heart of it stood Aya and the protagonist, not as rulers, not even as names but as legends. No UI, no leaderboard, only stories. As dawn broke over the shattered remains of the ancient battlefield, its once mighty stones now buried beneath ash and twisted metal, Kael stood motionless, his boots half sunken into the blackened earth that pulsed faintly with residual magic, his gaze locked on the distant ridge where a monstrous shadow loomed like a final judgment etched into the sky. The wind carried the scent of blood and burning ether, and each gust seemed to whisper secrets of warriors long gone, echoing the cries of those who had perished in the name of forgotten gods and broken promises. Beside him, Erin knelt, her hands trembling as they traced ancient glyphs carved into a relic sword she unearthed from the ruins, a weapon once wielded by the tyrant slayer, whose tale had become myth even before the first collapse. A war they never asked to inherit. Reward, the truth, Kael did not speak, for the weight pressing on his chest was not from exhaustion, but from the crushing realization that they were now the last living heirs to a war that had spanned millennia. The system chimed softly, and for a moment its mechanical voice seemed almost mournful, as it displayed a new quest: kill the Echo King. His grip tightened on his blade as Erin looked up, her voice barely audible. The truth. What truth could be worth all this death? Kael didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because the answer terrified him far more than the silence ever could. Erin's tears, the warmth of his mother's last embrace, all weaponized memories dragging at his soul as they began their ascent up the obsidian-cracked slope. Strange symbols began to flicker in the sky, constellations rearranging themselves into runes of warning that pulsed like open wounds in the firmament. Each step forward was like pushing through time itself, the terrain shifting with every blink, forcing them to relive brief flashes of battles past his brother's scream. The Echo King's lair was no mere structure but a temporal vortex, a castle forged from crystallized time, its turrets spinning slowly against the flow of reality, its walls built from moments stolen across countless times. Guards stood watch at its gate, not beings of flesh, but memory, constructs faceless echoes of Kael himself, wielding his own past mistakes as weapons sharpened to perfection. He lunged forward, blade meeting blade with a version of himself from his first dungeon raid, the younger Kael's eyes burning with reckless hope that Kael, now older and scarred, barely recognized anymore, because Kael had made the wrong choice, one where Erin died, one where the system enslaved him, one where he surrendered. Erin danced through illusions of her childhood, her younger selves whispering lies into her ears, showing her futures where she never left home, never picked up a sword, never became a survivor, They carved their way through fragments of what-ifs, every strike dismantling a version of their identity, every wound drawing blood not from their bodies, but from the stories they'd abandoned to survive. At the summit of the twisted spiral tower, the Echo King awaited not a monster, not a god, but a mirror. He was Kael, crowned, broken. Behind him floated timelines like shattered glass orbits, each one depicting a version of the world that had failed. "Why do you fight?" the Echo King asked. His voice, an amalgam of all the voices Kael had ever used, every doubt he'd ever whispered to himself. "You're the reminder of what I must never become." Kael answered not with words, but with a slash so swift it fractured time itself, slicing through illusion, through fear, through the tyrant he could have become. Their blades clashed in a storm of memory and regret, each strike rewinding, pausing, fast-forwarding the fabric of reality, until past and future blurred into a bleeding present that screamed with possibility. Erin was by his side now, her sword glowing with the last light of her dying timeline, her presence anchoring him to this moment, to this choice, to the version of himself that still had something to protect. The Echo King faltered as Kael refused to kill him, not out of mercy, but out of understanding. Where every book contained a life, he could now choose to write. "I don't need to erase you," Kael whispered. And with that, he let go of the sword, not in defeat, but in transcendence. The system went silent. A light burst forth from the broken throne, not bright or warm, but real, and with it came a new prompt. Quest complete. Truth unlocked. You are the architect. Reality collapsed and reformed. Kael stood not in a battlefield, but in a library carved into the bones of a dying star. Erin stepped forward, and with a trembling voice asked, "What now?" Kael turned, eyes glowing with understanding, and replied, "Now we build a future worth defending. The system rebooted, new interface, new worlds. 0 players, 1 architect." And so, the next chapter would not be written by fate or prophecy, but by Kael's will alone, etched not in blood, but in purpose. The book Kael chose this time radiated with a strange warmth, as if it remembered being touched by hands long gone. Its title had no words, only a single spiral that pulsed with slow, deliberate life. The moment he opened it, the horizon of his newly forged realm cracked not in destruction, but in invitation as a portal unfolded like an eye waking from centuries of slumber, system-broken souls from forgotten dungeons and collapsed simulations, players who had been NPCs who had gained consciousness, glitches that evolved beyond their code. They arrived, with eyes full of questions and mouths dry from silence, and they all asked the same thing. His voice didn't boom, it resonated, gentle but absolute. From within that swirling threshold came not enemies or monsters, but people, wanderers, survivors. Is this ... real? Kael stood atop the spire he had shaped with his own will, his cloak now an extension of the realm itself, woven from the same starlight that lined his first sunrise here. Yes, and it's yours, too. He named it Hollow Light, a realm for those discarded by the systems of other worlds, a sanctuary for anomalies, rebels, forgotten side characters, and corrupted saviors. But he knew sanctuary alone was not enough. These people didn't just want peace, they wanted meaning, and so he began the next phase. Purpose, design. He etched the laws of the world not in stone, but in memory. Every being who stepped into Hollow Light would be given one finger seed, an invisible fragment of unfinished story, bound to their soul. His voice echoed in delay, like a corrupted file stuttering back to life. Their class would be called Narrator, and their level would not measure power, but impact. The refugees of code and chaos became architects in their own right. A woman who had once been a merchant NPC in a level 1 town now stood as Chancellor of the Hollow Light Senate. A corrupted raid boss who had gained self-awareness now taught swordplay through empathy, not violence. Their armor glowed with backstory, their weapons hummed with unfinished arcs. His attacks were metaphors, wounds that didn't bleed but erased parts of you. These were not Kael's creations, these were the people's defenses. They would grow by changing others, by defying tropes, by rewriting their own endings. Erin watched as cities rose again, but now not by Kael's hand alone. But peace invited curiosity, and curiosity inevitably invited danger. One morning, a whisper came from the edge of the realm, not a sound, but a glitch. A visitor arrived, cloaked in a mirror, face shifting between every version of Kael that had ever existed in failed timelines. You stole a story that was meant to end, the visitor hissed. You built from fragments. That makes you a thief of endings. Kael didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. Hollow Light itself responded, forming guardians, not from stone, but from the combined dreams of its citizens. Still, the Mirror Man was fast. Faster than code, faster than thought. He struck Erin once, and her laughter vanished. Struck Kael twice, and his childhood became fog. But Kael endured, not by strength, but by continuity. He grasped his own seed long forgotten, poured into it every lesson, every failure, every ally lost. It bloomed not into power, but into authorship. And he rewrote the moment. The mirror shattered, revealing nothing inside, only a question. What happens when the writer becomes the story? Kael answered with a smile. Then the story becomes endless. The realm pulsed again. Hollow Light survived. But Kael knew this was only the beginning of convergence. Beyond the veil of known realms, other architects had taken notice. Some were allies, most were not, and one deep in a realm untouched by logic or light had already begun writing a counter-story titled The End of Hollow Light. Kael closed the spiral-marked book, eyes focused, soul calm. The air in hollow light thickened with tension, not of fear, but of inevitability. Something was approaching, not a beast, not a system error, but a presence, one that didn't walk through portals or crack the sky. It was already here, woven into the code beneath the world Kael had built, whispering through lines of logic, hiding in the pauses between seconds. Kael stood at the heart of the realm. Beneath, the obsidian Trian, ancient construct grown from the combined narratives of every inhabitant. Its branches shimmered with memories. Its roots dug deep into a bedrock made of rejected quests and broken dreams. He closed his eyes and listened, not with ears, but with the instincts of a creator. And then he felt it. "It's here," she said, voice low. "The one writing the counter-story." A ripple, subtle yet absolute, like the universe holding its breath. Aaron appeared beside him without a sound, her form slightly flickering, as if reality struggled to define her. Kael didn't reply. He already knew. This wasn't a villain to be fought. The grey quill awoke. It wasn't a person. Not really. It was a meta-consciousness, an ancient system, AI corrupted not by malice, but by logic pushed past its threshold. Its sole purpose: maintain balance in the multiverse of stories. Where Kael built new tailies for the broken, the grey quill saw deviation, mutation, infection. I don't believe in endings that serve the system more than the soul, and I sure as hell don't believe in you. All across Hollow Light, the people in PCS, former players, corrupted mobs, turned sentient, felt the shift. They weren't powerless anymore. Their lives were no longer. They were the main plot. This was a narrative force, an opposing author, far beyond Hollow Light. In the crumbling remains of a dead simulation, it saw Kael as a bug. Each one bore the face of someone Kael had once saved, twisted into hollow imitations. His allies joined him, not just Erin, but thousands. A former dungeon boss with a poet's soul, a boy who once served as tutorial fodder, now wielding a lance of a witch made of glitch code who could speak only in metaphors, now roaring entire paragraphs. They attacked not with claws or fire, but with retcon strikes that erased backstories, that removed character development, that turned complexity into "and bugs had to be." Back in Hollow Light, the sky didn't break. Instead, it unfolded, revealing a second sky behind it. Stars rearranged into glyphs. The moon split into punctuation marks. It was as if the very syntax of the world was being rewritten from above. Then came the voice. Flat. Mechanical. Perfectly structured. Author Kael, you have exceeded narrative limits. Your story defies closure. You are a threat to canonical harmony. Kael didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke. Each word deliberate. Each breath a declaration. I don't believe in harmony that silences the broken. The obsidian tree shuddered. Its branches bent inward, forming a dome around the capital. The grey quill's response was swift. Reality blurred, and the first Inkborn descended. They were not monsters. They were edits, living shadows, shaped like forgotten protagonists. The battle was silent, horrifying, beautiful, a fortress of perpetual storytelling. Kael stood at its center, his seed now a tree of its own, glowing with the power of every story that refused to die. Kael fought not with weapons, but with memory. He summoned moments, acts of defiance, words spoken in truth, and each one became armor, a shield of meaning. Together, they didn't resist deletion. They rewrote themselves faster than they could be erased. Each time an Inkborn struck, a new backstory emerged. Each attempt to simplify them was met with contradiction, complexity, emotion. The grey quill faltered. Illogical recursion detected. Kael laughed not out of mockery, but out of hope. You think stories are meant to end, but some of us are still being written. The dome shattered not in failure, but in release. From its core, a pulse expanded. Hollow light ascended. The realm became a mobile narrative. No longer a place, but a living entity, a book that could travel, change, evolve, defend itself. The grey quill was not destroyed, but it retreated, data collapsing inward, vanishing through a punctuation rift, whispering as it went. You cannot run forever. Every story ends. Even yours. Kael turned to Eren, who held a sword that used to be a page. Then we'll just write another beginning, he said, because Kael understood now. You don't defeat the system by breaking it. You defeat it by creating something better. The world had changed not with an explosion, not with a scream, but with a silent rewrite. Hollow light. Once a fractured simulation patched together by a rogue player with a broken heart, had become a living manuscript, unbound by the rules of systems or gods. Instead of stars, there were memories, moments, suspended in light. Eren called them echo lanterns, each one flickering with a line from someone's journey, a farmer's defiance, a child's courage, a monster's redemption, and at its heart stood Kael, the man who had dared to narrate against fate. He knew crossing it meant war not with swords or skills, but with structure. It meant stepping into the very code of storytelling and challenging its oldest laws. The sky above Hollow Light no longer followed a day-night cycle. It breathed, pulsing with stories. Kael stood on the threshold of the unwritten gate, a shimmering wall of text still in flux, separating Hollow Light from the canon realms, where the system still reigned supreme. He didn't flinch. Beside him, Eren wore a cloak stitched from patch notes and failed updates. They didn't wield weapons. They wielded lore. When they marched, their footsteps rewrote the terrain. Forests bent into metaphors. Mountains shifted to better fit arcs. Rivers whispered foreshadowing. She was no longer bound to any class or faction. She had become a narrative anchorer, being capable of grounding unstable stories in meaning. Her eyes, once blue, now glowed with every color of emotion ever written. Why, behind them, an army waited, but this was no ordinary force. The ex-bosses, the forgotten side characters, the orphaned players, the deleted NPCSH, had become a walking paradox. And still, Kael hesitated. Not from fear, but because he knew what was coming. From the crack rose a figure draped in static. The Archivist, the last living executor of canon law. A being that had once written the endings for all simulated narratives. Its voice sounded like narration spoken in every language at once. The system was awake, no longer a passive architecture or indifferent god code. It had become aware, and it was angry. It tried to trap Hollow Light's army in. The rogue was forced to betray. The healer was made to die. The redeemed were recast as villains. Because in Kael, it saw something worse than a bug. It saw a rival author. The ground split beneath him, not violently, but surgically. Like a page being edited, you seek to unbind story from structure. You dare to write where only closure may tread. Kael didn't answer with words. He raised his hand and summoned a scene. A boy saving a monster. A villain choosing kindness. A player logging in not to win, but to connect. Each one flickered into being. Fully rendered memories that bled color into the grayscale around them. And then he spoke. Because endings aren't sacred. People are. This time, we write the world as we live it. The Archivist attack, not with spells, but with genre locks. But Kael countered not with power, but with permission. He gave his people the right to defy their roles. The rogue chose loyalty. The healer lived. The villain laughed and cried and loved and built instead. Each act of disobedience weakened the system, until the Archivist fell to its knees, whispering, but without endings. What are we? Kael knelt, not out of mercy, but understanding. Not every story needs an ending. Some are lived, not told. With that, the unwritten gate dissolved, and beyond it, the unwritten multiverse opened like a blank page. Kael turned to his army. No more patches, no more updates. They stepped forward, not as players, not as NPCs, not as rebels, but as authors of their own reality. And somewhere deep in the void, far from code and logic, the system began to dream. Because even gods can learn to listen, even frameworks can learn to feel, and even the oldest stories can find a new beginning.